in the frontier, Decius led, or followed as some of the histories imply, the rest of the men on a march to Italy, where they planned to confront Philip and force him to abdicate. Word reached Rome soon after that the troops were on the move, and Philip scrambled to assemble a defense force. There was no such thing as a nice, quiet abdication at this point in Roman history, and Philip knew that if he wanted to keep his head, he was going to have to keep his throne, and if he wanted to keep his throne, he was going to have to fight for it. The preparations were no doubt fraught with desperation. Philip knew full well he wouldn't be able to raise enough troops to match the size of Decius's force. But the year of the Six Emperors had proved that Italy could ward off an angry legionary force given the right amount of luck and determination. So it's not like Philip necessarily believed he was preparing for some suicidal last stand. But luck and determination were not on Philip's side. Decius was no Maximinus Thrax, and Philip was no hardy brotherhood of senators valiantly defending the honor of Italy from an evil tyrant. So, the story played out differently this time. In the summer of 249, Decius and Philip faced off near Verona in northern Italy. Despite frequent letters swearing fealty to the emperor, Decius was unable to calm the temper of his men, and however he felt in his heart, that all took a back seat when it came time to act. The two sides joined in a short battle, and Philip's army was easily routed. It is unclear whether he and his son were killed during the fighting itself or a few days after their defeat, but within a week of the battle, Philip was dead, and Decius was on his way to Rome to have the Senate ratify his ascension to the throne. Philip the Arab was 44 years old and had ruled the empire for 5 years. As I said, Decius was no Maximinus Thrax, and the Senate was more than happy to raise one of their own to the purple. In addition to the title Augustus, they also gave Decius the honorific Trajanus, a hopeful nod that the new emperor...
Hey, what's up, man? Yeah, I can't wait. Baseball is just horrible to watch. I'm actually going to the Steeler game in Ireland in September. Fucker. Yeah, they're playing shit, I forget. Hold on. Let me check my my text message here. Oh, the Vikings. Yeah, it should be a fun trip. It's gonna be expensive as shit, but you only live once, you know? I mean, he seems to be bought in, so that's a good thing. And then apparently, from what the offense coordinator said, he's gonna open it up, I guess, a little bit more. But we got Jalen Ramsey this afternoon, actually. Traded Mika, which is gonna hurt because we don't have no real safety on the team right now. Who's your guys starting QB now? I'm trying to think. Did you guys draft someone? Oh, you piece of shit. Oh, that's right. You got... Ah, that's right. That's where he went. I mean, shit, he won us a lot of games last year. He didn't get really much of a shot, though. I forgot that's where he went. That's right, week 1 revenge game. I hope you don't pull that shit where he blows out his knee, first play of the game. Motherfucker. Oh, man. Yeah, I catch it occasionally. Not every week, though. I saw Adam Ray said he was going to be on there tonight. You piece of shit. God damn it. Oh, that was worth so much. Oh my god, yeah, him and Gillis. That had me crying. They played off each other so perfect, too.
Would prove to be as wise and as capable as the great Trajan had been. Theseus sent the legions who had carried him to power back to the Danube, while he himself stayed in Rome to consolidate power and take stock of the empire he now led. The Milesian legions received a healthy donative for their day's work, temporarily stilling their desire for a war with the Goths. Eventually, though, they would get their war, and soon come to realize that maybe they shouldn't have been quite so eager to take on the northern barbarians. This moment of realization probably came right around the time they were all being hacked to death in a muddy and bloody swamp. When Theseus was done taking stock of the empire, he declared that he did not much like what he saw. The Sassanids had been dishonorably paid off in the east, the Goths menaced the north, and Rome itself was a cesspool of vice and corruption. The Roman Empire had lost its way, and the new emperor was determined to get it back on the right track. The main problem, Theseus decided, was not shifting demographics or economic fluctuations or the threat of foreign invasion, but rather the loss of public virtue. That virtue, which had helped Rome win the favor of the gods, had been abandoned, and so the gods had abandoned Rome. To help the empire get back on the good side of those supernatural forces that obviously determined the course of earthly affairs, Theseus dreamed up two major initiatives. First, he was going to demand that every citizen in the empire offer sacrifices to convince the gods that Rome had not forsaken them. And second, he was going to revive the long-abandoned office of censor so that someone would be in place to regulate and legislate public morality.
You piece of shit.
Taken together, Theseus figured that this would be enough to please the gods and prevent them from heaping any more misery on the Romans. It seems, though, that given what's about to happen, the gods were not at all impressed by these offerings. Theseus started in January of 250 by issuing his famous edict that every citizen of the empire must offer a sacrifice to the gods on behalf of the emperor. The edict seems innocuously pious enough, but it was well known that a certain minority of citizens were going to have a big problem with this seemingly simple request, and it is completely plausible that Theseus's idea of getting back on the good side of the gods had nothing to do with sacrifices at all. but instead had everything to do with the complete suppression of Christianity. The mechanics of the edict were simple. A magistrate would announce that everyone in his municipality had, say, 30 days to offer the proper sacrifices, and then you would be issued a ticket after having performed said sacrifices. The officials would then come around after the 30 days were up and make sure everyone had their ticket. And if you didn't have it, well, that was treason, and treason meant torture and death. Across the empire, Christians heard about the edict, immediately recognized it as being totally incompatible with their belief system, and tried to figure out what exactly they were going to do. Some broke right away, made the necessary sacrifices, and either left Christianity behind forever or asked for forgiveness after the fact. But most refused and hoped that the Roman authorities would not pursue any heavy-handed reprisals. What was the big deal if a few Christians didn't take part in these pagan rituals? They paid their taxes and kept out of trouble. And for the last few years, that had been more than enough to keep them flying below the imperial radar. But Decius had no intention of pursuing a policy of toleration, and when the first batch of Christians let time expire without making a sacrifice, Decius recommended to the local authorities that they go ahead with the torture and the executions. Like a wave spreading across the empire, defiant Christians were rounded up and killed as the deadline for sacrificing came and went in each new province. Over the course of 250, thousands of Christians, both prominent and obscure, were executed, including Pope Fabian, who set the tone for the faithful by accepting martyrdom at the end of January 250, not long after the edict was first issued. Perhaps revealing what this was all really about, Decius then prevented the Christians from electing a new bishop of Rome, and the office remained vacant until the emperor left the capital to go fight the Goths 18 months later. Not to get too far off into ecclesiastic history, but when a new pope finally was elected again, it set off a minor schism within the church over the question of how exactly to treat those Christians who had made the sacrifices and now wanted to return to the church. Did they need to be rebaptized, or was sincere repentance enough? And this was a heavy question that caused a great deal of angry debate. So, while not succeeding in eliminating Christianity, Decius did do much to sow some serious discord within the church. While the persecution of Christians raged across the empire, Decius made a play to further reintroduce the Romans to the virtuous ways of their forefathers by reviving the office of censor. But rather than claiming the title for himself, as previous emperors had done, Decius picked a man he thought worthy of the job and offered Publius Licinius Valerianus the opportunity to lead Rome's moral revival. But Valerian, as we know him today, thought long and hard about the offer, and in the end, risked the wrath of the emperor by declining to take the job. Not only was the task shaping up to be an impossible one, hey, you see that water over there? Make it run uphill, okay? But the censorship was, when you read the fine print, an incredibly powerful office. To don the title of censor would be to don a title that would make Valerian practically the equal of Decius, and that was a very dangerous place to be. He could see that in time, that kind of power would probably make Decius violently paranoid, even if it had been his idea to begin with. Valerian was a smart guy. The job was impossible, and the position was just too dangerous. No good could come of it, so he declined. He told Decius that the office was too august to be held by anyone but the Augustus himself, and asked instead for a regular old military posting in Germany. Decius granted the request and let Valerian slip away with his head intact. We do not know whether the emperor planned to let the matter drop completely, or whether he was dead set on bringing the censor back to Rome, because shortly after Valerian's refusal, the Goths once again invaded the empire, bringing an end to Decius's experiments with public virtue. In late 250, a Gothic king named Cniva, that's the pronunciation I'm going with, led an army across the Danube and began running amok in Thrace and Moesia. Though we call this army the Goths, they were actually a far more cosmopolitan force than the name suggests. Cneva raised a standard that Germans and Sarmatians, and even a healthy number of Roman deserters flocked to. So while we call them the Goths, remember that a number of different nationalities all fought for Cneva, not just the Goths themselves, though they were the thick trunk of the invading army. Cneva's forces overran the border defenses easily, which was what prompted so many Roman soldiers to desert. And after extracting a large payment from Marcianopolis not to sack their city, the Goths were soon laying siege to the city of Nicopolis. Provincial leaders begged Decius to personally lead a relief army to evict these most unwelcome guests, and Decius, recognizing how dire the situation was, immediately began preparations for the march north. In early 251, he was on his way along with his 24-year-old son Herennius, who Decius had induced the Senate to make his co-Augustus shortly before their departure. This new father and son team was supposed to destroy the Goths and then go on to found a great new dynasty. But instead what happened is that they both died and went down in history as the first emperors to fall in battle against a foreign enemy. Now the Persians will tell you that that honor really belongs to Gordian III, but let's not concern ourselves with that for now. The Goths had not taken Nicopolis by the time Decius and his reinforcements arrived, so Cneva abandoned the siege and headed off for greener pastures. But for the Romans, this was not about simply coming to the aid of Nicopolis. It was about throwing the Goths out of the empire entirely. So Decius and his army pursued Cneva across the countryside. No slouch when it came to strategy and tactics, the Gothic king saw the Romans coming hot on his heels and decided to use their headlong charge against them. Decius was pushing his troops hard on the assumption that Cneva was running as fast as he could. But what the Gothic king was actually doing was turning his army around and pointing them straight back at the unsuspecting legions. Believing the Goths to be nowhere near them, the Romans set up camp for the night, and though guards were of course posted, no one was expecting to be doing any fighting for at least a couple of days. But then, out of nowhere, the full Gothic army appeared over a hill and came barreling at the Roman position. Caught completely off guard, Decius tried to keep his men in line, but the shock of the attack scattered the legions, and the subsequent retreat involved a lot more running than the emperor probably would have liked. Satisfied that he had spooked the Romans off the chase, Cneva then headed off to the nearby city of Philippopolis, which he planned to sack before the Romans were able to regroup. The Goths were, after all, here to plunder the wealth of the empire, not engage the legions in unproductive battles. But by not following up on his surprise attack, Cneva allowed Decius time to reform his embarrassed army. The emperor rebuilt their confidence by leading them against a series of much smaller German forces who were attempting to join Cneva's invincible army, and pretty soon they were feeling okay about themselves again. Cneva's invincible army, though, was only invincible when fighting in head-to-head battles. When it came to laying siege to cities, they lacked the kind of sophisticated equipment necessary to do the job right, and the siege of Philippopolis, like the siege of Nicopolis, took longer than it was supposed to. And while the Romans regained their strength, Cneva saw the strength of his own army slowly slipping away. But eventually, the citizens of Philippopolis could hold out no longer, and they were forced to surrender their city. In the subsequent sack, it is reported that 100,000 men, women, and children were killed. Cneva, emboldened, then grabbed Titus Julius Priscus, the governor of Thrace, who may or may not have been in on the whole thing and been the one who betrayed Philippopolis to the Goths, and proclaimed Priscus emperor of the Roman Empire under the generous protection of the Gothic king. This attempt to seize the empire in one fell swoop was short-lived, though. Not only did Priscus die shortly after becoming emperor, cause of death unknown, but Decius and his reinvigorated army arrived on the scene and slowly began to surround the Gothic position. Aware that the siege had depleted his forces dangerously, Cneva decided it was time for the Goths to make their getaway. They piled their carts high with accumulated treasure, and made a run for the northern border. Confident both in his numerical superiority and just the superiority of the legions in general, Theseus chased down the fleeing Goths and made every effort to fight them as soon as possible. A decisive battle would prove to the Goths that messing with Rome got you nowhere, and would prove to the Romans themselves that the dominance of the legions was still a matter of fact, not a matter of imagined reputation. But boy, did he wind up proving just the opposite. The mistake Decius made was that he was so eager to engage the Goths that he basically ceded the decision of where the battle would take place to Cneva. The Gothic king chose a spot just south of the Danube near the town of Abritus, and arranged his men in 3 lines, strategically positioning the third line just behind some marshy swampland, so that the front Gothic ranks kept the site screened from the Romans. I won't say that the battle was already decided before the first spear was tossed, but allowing Cneva to pick the time and the place of the battle was a fatal blunder. Remember, kids, if there is one thing the history of warfare has proven again and again, it's that, like real estate, the name of the game is location, location, location. Don't let your enemy pick the battle site. Chances are the spot he will pick is a spot that complements his strengths and negates yours. If he offers battle someplace you're not sure of, avoid the temptation to fight it out, and instead focus on drawing him into a spot of your choosing. I can promise you, you will like the results a whole lot better. Just ask Decius. According to legend, the Battle of Abritus started ominously for the Romans, as Herennius was struck by an arrow and killed in the opening minutes of the fight. Theseus, however, used the shocking death of his son as a way to rally his men, crying out, "Let no one mourn. The death of one soldier is no great loss to the Republic." This stirring scene is of course apocryphal, but I figured I'd pass it along since that was the way the Romans told the story to each other. Regardless, the moment was soon forgotten as the legions plunged into the damp hell that awaited them in front of that third Gothic line. The legions pushed the Goths back, and pushed the Goths back, and pushed the Goths back, leaving the Romans with the impression that the battle was now going great. The first Gothic line broke, and then the second gave way, and the Romans pursued the fleeing barbarians with reckless abandon, sure that victory was just within their grasp. But the legions pursued the fleeing Goths right into the marshlands, and right into Cneva's trap. Bogged down in the marsh, the Romans were surrounded by the last Gothic line. A fierce combat followed, but the terrain was too much for the Romans to overcome, and the battle turned into a slaughter. Theseus himself disappeared in the fighting, and his body was never recovered from the swamp. He was 50 years old, and had ruled the empire for 2 years. The governor of Upper Moesia, a general named Trebonianus Gallus, was left in command of the remnants of the Roman army, and soon after the battle, he negotiated a peace with Cneva. The Goths would be allowed to leave Roman territory unmolested with all the treasure they had accumulated, which, yeah, it's not like the Romans could have stopped Cneva from doing anything he wanted anyway. But the Roman general also worked out a deal that would pay Cneva an annual tribute in exchange for the Gothic king agreeing to stay out of Roman territory. This last bit became the source of a later rumor that Gallus had actually conspired with Cneva before the battle to ensure a Roman defeat. But given all the other circumstances of the battle and his later conduct, there is no reason to believe that Gallus had anything at all to do with the defeat at Abritus. The Battle of Abritus was one of the most shocking setbacks in Roman history. Though not quite as existentially terrifying as Cannae, the results of the battle still came as a mortal shock to the folks back home. The emperor was dead, his army destroyed. Who or what is going to protect us now? Decius had set out to prove that the Romans were still the biggest kid on the block, and had wound up proving exactly the opposite. And this new Gothic terror filled the Romans with a dread they had not really felt since the days of Hannibal. How are we going to survive if our supposedly invincible legions are so easily destroyed? There was no ready answer, and the citizens of the Empire began to live with a fear in their hearts that they had never experienced before. Really, at that moment, it did not seem like the end was that far off. I want to end this week with a quick note on the tours. The first trip, as I already mentioned, is sold out, but we do have some space available on trips 2 and 3, which will run from May 17 to May 26, and from May 28 to June 7, respectively. It will be exactly the same itinerary, just over a different span of days. So if the first set of dates didn't work out for you, or you thought you had already missed your chance to go, then by all means, come along on one of the other trips. I should also note that we have removed the transatlantic airfare from the tour package. Once we started to get a feel for what would work out best for everyone, especially since so many international travelers will be along, it became obvious that the airfare to Rome and from Istanbul was more of a hindrance than a help to most people, so we made the decision to drop that part of the package. We will by all means help everyone make the proper arrangements, but just know that the price you see no longer includes those tickets. So, thehistoryofrometour.com. Act now because, as they say, good seats are still available, but won't be forever. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 111, Phase 1 complete. The Battle of Abritus forced the Romans to deal with something they had never before had to face, the death of an emperor in battle. Up until now, emperors had died of natural causes, or they had been assassinated, or they had committed suicide, but never had they fallen to an enemy's sword. The gods struck down emperors, or the Romans struck down emperors, or emperors struck down themselves. But they were not knocked off by some common barbarian warrior. It simply wasn't done. But while this humiliating blow to the national psyche was immense, the Romans did not have long to dwell on their misery, because there was one big practical problem the death of Decius had left them with. Who would rule now? The elevation of Decius' son Herennius to the rank of co-emperor just a few months earlier was supposed to have solved this problem, but he too had died at Abritus, leaving the empire not just without a leader, but without a leader in its darkest hour. To extract the empire from this predicament, the Senate and the army both came up with solutions to the problem of who would rule. Unfortunately, they were different solutions. The army naturally chose to elevate one of their own, specifically the senior ranking officer left on the scene after the disaster at Abritus, Gaius Vibius Trebonianus Gallus. Back in Rome, though, the Senate chose to stick with the hereditary rights of Decius' family and elected Gaius Valens Hostilianus Messius Quintus, Decius' youngest son, who had been left behind in Rome while his father and brother had gone off to fight the Goths. The big justifiable fear after Decius' death was that some kind of civil war would break out at a moment when a lack of internal unity might prove fatal. And with the Senate and armies backing separate candidates for the throne, that seemed to be the deadly path Rome was headed down. But the inevitable confrontation between Hostilian and Gallus never arrived, in part because Gallus decided that circumstances demanded that someone take the high road and offer a compromise. Sitting in a tent out near the Danube, surrounded by the remnants of an army that had just been annihilated by the Goths, Gallus recognized that this was no time for a civil war. If he wasted the time and energy of what was left of Decius' army on some power grab, the Goths could just sweep down, conquer the Middle Empire, and split Rome in half. So while he made it clear to the Senate that he planned to accept the army's acclaim, he also made it clear that he had no problem with Hostilian serving as his co-emperor. He was able to come to this magnanimous conclusion because, 1, he had always been on excellent terms with Decius and his family, and did not instinctively see Hostilian as a rival, and 2, the age difference between them, Hostilian was still a teenager, meant that Gallus would always be the senior Augustus. Accepting Hostilian, then, was more like accepting an heir than a true colleague. Plus, it's not like the Moesian legions were in any condition to force their demands on anyone. Though it seems a bit crazy to think about, Trebonianus Gallus was a rare figure at this point in Roman history. He was an emperor of fully Italian extraction. Since the fall of the Flavian dynasty, the imperial office had been populated by Spaniards and Africans and Thracians and Illyrians, but only on a few rare occasions was the Emperor of Rome actually an Italian. Now, of course, we can't read too much into this, as many of these emperors, the Trajans and Hadrians and Severans of the world, either came from Italian families transplanted into the provinces, or from provincial families who had married into important Italian clans. But still, it is worth noting that an emperor born in Italy to an Italian family had, by the 3rd century, become something of an endangered species. Gallus was born into a senatorial family of Etruscan origin, and had spent his life working his way up the cursus honorum, serving in civilian and military posts across the empire. At some point, he became an associate of Decius's, and when Decius became emperor, he immediately appointed Gallus to govern the province of Upper Moesia. The appointment underscores the close working relationship between the two men, as the governorship of Upper Moesia was no honorary ambassadorship to Tahiti. This was, after all, a territory not only being harassed by the Goths, but which had also been ground zero for the rebellion that had put Decius in power in the first place. The degree to which Decius trusted and respected Gallus is obvious, and the new governor quickly became trusted and respected by the men under his command as well. A full bronze statue of Gallus still exists that depicts a large, barrel-chested man with close-cropped hair, cutting and imposing figure. He was not some aristocratic dandy the Moesian legions could hope to push around. Not that they had time for such bullying. Gallus took over in 250 AD, and for the next 18 months he led the Roman response to the increasing Gothic raids. Sometimes he was successful, and sometimes he wasn't, but no one could argue that Gallus wasn't exerting maximum effort in an attempt to stem the barbarian tribe. When Cniva invaded with a full force, though, the Moesian legions were simply unable to do anything to stop him, and Gallus was one of those provincial leaders who told Decius in no uncertain terms that the lower Danube needed reinforcements and fast. He then served as one of Decius's key generals during the campaign against the Gothic king, and wound up being one of the few to escape from Abritus alive. As I said at the end of last week's show, Gallus took over what was left of the legions and came to an understanding with the victorious Cniva. The Romans would not hinder the Gothic retreat back across the Danube, and henceforth, payment would be made annually to the Gothic king to prevent him from attacking in the future. Though later Romans would castigate Gallus for this ignoble peace, modern scholars seem more than willing to give him a pass. He was in an incredibly difficult position, and doing the best he could to save the empire from further humiliation. The rumor that he and Cniva were in cahoots started up a few years later, but no one at the time, and no one now, really believes that those smears hold much water. The men of the Shattered Legions who had just elected him emperor certainly didn't think he was a traitor who had just gotten most of them killed. Otherwise, they would have torn him limb from limb, rather than giving him the keys to the empire. The peace deal with Geneva is evidence that Gallus was of a mind to walk the Romans away from the Battle of Abritus without making things any worse than they already were. But the external threat posed by the Goths was not the only source of potential peril. Gallus also had to make a choice about how to deal with the Senate's elevation of Hostilian. In this too, Gallus showed that he was more interested in making sure things didn't get worse than he was in just about anything else. So he sent a letter to the Senate informing them that their choice of Hostilian was a fine one, and that he would be happy to share the imperial insignia with the son of Decius. The Senate was no more disposed to start up a civil war than Gallus was, and immediately accepted the compromise. With the Goths temporarily sated, Gallus and a few key advisors made their way back to Rome to meet with Hostilian and the Senate, so that together they could work up for a plan on how to stabilize the empire, which was clearly teetering on the brink of something. When he arrived back in the capital, Gallus and Hostilian were acclaimed as the co-Augusti of Rome, and Gallus' son Volusianus was named Caesar and eventual heir to the throne. The partnership between Gallus and Hostilian, though, wouldn't last the year. In the summer of 251, Hostilian mysteriously vanished from the historical record, and we can only guess at what happened to him. Gallus conspiracy theorists claim that the young Augustus had been offed by the evil betrayer of Abritus, but the consensus opinion seems to be that Hostilian fell victim to a new plague that had chosen this inopportune moment to appear on the scene, the Cyprian Plague, so named because its effects were described in detail by Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage. As with the Antonine Plague, there is some debate over which particular disease ravaged the empire for the next 20 years, but again, as with the Antonine Plague, smallpox appears to be the likely culprit. If there is one recent cliché that I have really come to loathe, it is the cliché of the quote, perfect storm. Everyone these days wants to describe everything as a perfect storm, making it hard to distinguish when an incredibly rare confluence of events produces something historically destructive, and when someone just wants to use the phrase, a perfect storm, to lend whatever minor crisis they're describing some dramatic heft. Really, I promise you, the overuse of a perfect storm is a big pet peeve of mine. With that in mind, the crisis of the 3rd century was a perfect storm. The empire was already being ravaged by external pressures stronger than it had known in centuries, violent internal political division, economic depression, soaring taxation, and now, on top of everything else, a massive plague was breaking out. You guys, this is what a perfect storm looks like. At the height of the Cyprian Plague, which ran from 251 until sometime after 270, 5,000 people died every day in Rome, and the bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Manpower shortages inevitably resulted in fields and in the army barracks, leading to further economic depression, famine, and anemic border defense. This at a time when the last thing the empire could afford was economic depression, famine, and anemic border defense. Besides Hostilian, the plague would eventually claim the life of the Emperor Claudius Gothicus as well, a man who was well on his way to leading Rome out of the darkness when he died prematurely in his camp. Really, I will never stop marveling at how the Roman Empire was able to survive the 3rd century. Everyone always wants to know why Rome fell, but I think the more fascinating question is how it managed to survive as long as it did. Over the course of the next few episodes, I hope to get to the bottom of that particular mystery. Seriously, these were bad times that the Romans should not have lived through. Though the Romans had been focused for the last few years on the threat in the north posed by the Goths, it was during the short reign of Gallus that they were reminded that the Sassanids still posed a major threat in the east. Shapur had been biding his time after making peace with Philip the Arab back in 244, but once word trickled over to the Sassanid king that the Romans were getting battered around by a Gothic invasion, it did not take him long to call an army back into the field and point them west.
Let me guess. House Azadi sent my time.
The
is
strength of
precious.
Rome was at a
Don't
low
waste it.
ebb, and now was the perfect opportunity to maybe peel off some of that old Persian territory his family had been coveting all these years. The results of Sharpwar's campaign would prove as disastrous to the Romans as Cniva's campaign had just been, and when the Romans finally got around to responding, the results of that campaign would prove to be even more disastrous still. Bad times. Bad, bad times.
Let's not drag.
As is so often the case in Roman history, Armenia lay at the center of this latest outbreak of hostilities between East and West. The chronology on all of this is a bit muddled, but it appears that Shapur used a dispute over Armenian succession as a pretext for invading the Buffer Kingdom. After marching around unopposed and placing his own man on the throne, Shapur then shocked everyone by directly invading the Roman province of Syria. As had just happened in the north, the eastern legions were so used to simply keeping watch without any real fear of direct attack that the sudden invasion caught them completely by surprise. Shapur captured key legionary garrisons and sacked important cities, including, amazingly, Antioch itself. After his string of victories, Shapur chose to withdraw from Syria as winter descended, rather than attempt an occupation at this early stage in the game. Rome may be weakened, but it certainly wasn't defenseless. The easy success of his initial foray into Roman territory, though, had to have had Shapur's mouth watering. Back in Rome, the surprising news of this marauding Sassanid army was met by an equally surprising reaction from the Emperor Gallus, relative indifference. He ordered the Syrian legions to regroup and defend themselves properly the next time Shapur came calling, but other than that, he made no move to travel to Syria himself or to raise emergency reinforcements to help shore up the eastern front. This latter bit is at least somewhat understandable, as the north was already stretched dangerously thin, and the plague was making recruiting difficult. But there's no getting around the fact that Gallus did not seem much moved by the danger posed by the Sassanids. Perhaps had he lived, he would have done as Valerian eventually did, and led the counterattack personally. But Romans at the time whispered that perhaps there was more soft Italian in Gallus than he liked to let on, and that the luxuries of Rome were seducing him away from his responsibilities. Discontentment with Gallus, as you can imagine, began to grow apace from this point on. With all of this swirling around, bad news once again came down from the Danube in 253. Cniva let it be known that he was unhappy about the payments he had been promised, and if Gallus didn't do something about it, the Gothic king was going to consider their peace treaty null and void. It is unclear whether the Romans were actually withholding the funds they had promised, or whether Cniva was simply trying to extort more cash from his weakened opponent, but the word went back up to give the Gothic king no more than he had already been given. Cniva, insulted, made preparation. preparations for a new invasion of the empire. After Gallus left for Rome, the man put in charge of the northern border was Marcus Aemilius Aemilianus, a general of North African extraction who had been appointed to a legionary command in Moesia by Decius and promoted to overall command by Gallus following the disaster at Abritus. Aemilianus faced the frightening prospect of dealing with the same Gothic army that had just whipped the Romans handily, only this time with fewer men and more raw recruits. The odds, needless to say, were not in his favor. When Cneva did cross the Danube in 253, though, the Gothic king let his arrogance get the better of him, and Aemilianus was able to surprise the Goths and deliver a smashing victory for the legions. This time, it was Cneva who found himself leading off the wounded remnants of a once mighty army, and the world was reminded that the Romans were not done for yet. Aemilianus was an overnight sensation, and for having done what two emperors had been unable to do, the exuberant troops honored their general the best way they knew how. They proclaimed him emperor. And if you think that by acclaiming their fourth emperor in just 5 years, the Moesian legions were hitting the peak of their fickleness, well, let's just give it another 3 months. The news that the men who had proclaimed him emperor were now proclaiming someone else emperor finally roused Gallus from his apparent slumber. He sent an order up to Valerian, the commander of the Upper Rhine, and the man Decius had tried to make censor, demanding that Valerian lead his troops to Italy at once to help Gallus smack down this would-be usurper. The emperor then induced the Senate to declare Aemilianus an enemy of the state, and he gathered up a defense force and marched north to prevent the Moesian legions from entering Italy. But Aemilianus was well aware that time was of the essence, and while Gallus gathered his defenses, the Moesian general was already marching on Italy to cement his claim to the throne. The Danube legions had been weakened by war and disease, and if Aemilianus was to have any shot at all at unseating Gallus, he needed to strike before the emperor could muster all the forces at his disposal. If he was thinking in particular about the Rhine legions, then he was right to move fast. By getting to Gallus before the Rhine troops did, he was able to emerge victorious from something approaching an equal contest. Not that it did him much good. Fast or slow, when the Rhine legions did arrive, Aemilianus found himself done for anyway. But we'll get to that in a minute. Aemilianus was already in Italy and speeding down the eastern branch of the Flaminian Way when he was finally met by an army led by Gallus and Volusianus. There are two accounts of what happened next. The first states that Aemilianus defeated Gallus after a short battle, and that Gallus and his son then fled north to await the coming Rhine reinforcements. Their way was then cut short by members of the Praetorian Guard, who saw the wind shifting in Aemilianus' favor, and figured that they could get in good with the new emperor by bringing him the head of the old. They murdered Gallus and Volusianus, leaving Aemilianus' path to the throne clear. The other account is that there was no battle at all, and that Gallus' troops defected to Aemilianus before a single spear was thrown, leaving Gallus and Volusianus alone and unprotected, at which point they were executed by Aemilianus. Whichever way it happened, by the end of August 253, Gallus was dead. He was 47 years old and had ruled the empire for 2 years. The death of Gallus ushered in the glorious reign of Emperor Aemilianus, which began the moment Gallus died and ended the moment Valerian arrived in Italy with the Rhine legions. This glorious reign probably lasted about a month. When the new emperor arrived in Rome, he was greeted coolly by the Senate. Gallus had not been their first choice to lead the empire, and they were probably no more pleased with his lingering in the capital than anyone else, but he had gone out of his way to avoid civil war by proposing joint rule with Hostilian. Civil war was the last thing the empire needed, and here now was a man who had gone ahead and started one anyway. Emilianus was not unaware of his standing in the capital, so when he arrived, he went to great lengths to convince the Senate of his benign intentions. He told the senators that he saw himself merely as a general, and that he had neither the time nor the inclination to be the political, economic, and moral leader of the empire. That, he said, would be the Senate's responsibility. He himself would be too busy defending Rome from its foreign enemies to worry about politics. He planned, he said, to be but an instrument of the empire, and more specifically, an instrument of the Senate. Their egos now more than satisfied. Any opposition to Emilianus washed away as they contemplated this enticing new dynamic he had proposed. A partnership between the military and the civilian authorities, rather than all power being claimed by a single man. It was a positively intoxicating thought for the power-starved Senate. But like I say, the glorious reign of Emilianus only lasted a few weeks. Valerian had never stopped moving south after the death of Gallus, and he now entered Italy in mid to late 253, with an eye not on saving Gallus, but revenging him. Emilianus' position was now reversed, and just a few weeks after marching down the Flaminian Way to confront Gallus, he found himself marching right back up it again to confront Valerian. On the same eastern branch of the road, though a bit further south, the two commanders met at the heads of their respective armies. Overawed by both the larger force from the Rhine and by the reputation of Valerian, the Moesian legions once again abandoned their master in favor of another and defected en masse to Valerian. In the process of this defection, Emilianus was cornered and killed by his own officers, so that there would be no misunderstanding where their new loyalties lay. Emilianus was in his early 40s and had enjoyed the novelty of calling himself emperor for just about 3 months. The death of Emilianus closes out the first phase of the crisis of the 3rd century. This first phase, running roughly from 238 to 253, set the tone for the remainder of the crisis. The legions elevating and abandoning emperors, the Goths invading from the north, the Sassanids invading from the east, the Cyprian plague sucking the life out of Rome's army and economy, and in general, the bonds that had held the empire together fraying to the breaking point. During the middle phase, all of these factors would combine to explode Rome into an anarchic mess. Lasting from 253 to 268, this middle phase will be defined by the reigns of Valerian and his son Gallienus. Now, in the context of the times, the 15-year combined reign of Valerian and his son seems to indicate a level of stability, but in fact, it masks instability on a scale that would only be matched during the final decades of the 400s AD as the West fell apart completely. Those of you who have read ahead know that not only did imperial usurpers rise and fall faster during this middle phase of the crisis than at any other period in Roman history, but also that beginning in the 260s, the empire would actually spend about 15 years divided into thirds, after new kingdoms in the northwest and east successfully broke away from Rome. The final phase of the crisis, which lasted roughly from the death of Gallienus in 268 until the elevation of Diocletian in 284, was the recovery period, during which a series of vigorous emperors from Illyria battled back through the chaos to re-establish the supremacy of Rome, both internally and externally. Next time, we'll open the middle phase of the crisis with the elevation of Valerian and his son Gallienus. Though Valerian was at the time one of the most respected men in the empire, his destiny was unfortunately to go down in history as an imperial embarrassment. To his credit, he immediately opened up a war in the east to punish the Sassanids for their sack of Syria. But when he was captured alive by Shapur in 260, his name became synonymous with the general felling of once mighty Rome. There will be no episode next week as I am headed down to the Austin City Limits Music Festival, but we'll be back in 2 weeks to see just how bad we can make things for the Romans.
Something quite interesting happens when you apply a drop of a feeling that if I hammer on this thing's front end, I could not allow me to take my ruined hammer to this thing's tail end. Can't get any worse, right? Of a feeling that if I hammer on this thing's front end, I could knock some of its enchantments about a bit.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 112, Captured Alive. In the autumn of 253 AD, the troops supporting short-lived Emperor Aemilius Aemilianus abandoned the man they had so recently elevated to the purple and defected en masse to Valerian. I think we can forgive the Romans for at first not investing too much emotional energy in this newly appointed emperor, because, after all, in the 18 years since the assassination of Alexander Severus, the empire had seen 11 different men claim the title Augustus. There was absolutely no reason to believe that the new emperor would not simply come and go along with all the rest. But when Valerian descended from the Alps, he wound up bringing with him 15 years of relative stability at the top of the political pyramid, at least in a sense. Sure, the western provinces of Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, Germania Superior, Germania Inferior, and Raetia would break away in 260, losses that would be matched in that year when Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and most of Asia Minor came under the control of the city of Palmyra. But the middle of the empire, Greece and the Balkans and Italy, would, from 253 to 268, be the domains of Valerian and his son, Publius Licinius Ignatius Gallienus, and their reign will form the bridge between the old empire of Augustus and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius and the coming empire of Diocletian and Constantine and Theodosius. Now, whether the fractured stability of Gallienus was more dangerous than the unified political anarchy that preceded him is a question scholars still debate today. As soon as Valerian's claim to power was recognized by the Senate in October 253, he wasted no time inducing them to further elevate his son Gallienus to the rank of co-Augustus. Having two emperors was a critical part of Valerian's plan for the empire, and indeed, the rapidity with which he began to pursue that plan have left some questioning whether or not the new emperor had dragged his feet a little getting out of Germany. That maybe, after receiving the distress call from Gallus, that Valerian decided to simply let Gallus and Aemilianus fight it out, which would allow him to sweep down and brush aside whoever was left standing after the showdown. But whether he was actively planning for what he would do when he became emperor, or whether he just had an idea of what he would do if he became emperor, there was very little separating Valerian's elevation to the throne and the announcement that he was heading to Syria to reassert Roman power in the east. The main point of rising up Gallienus was so that Valerian could be sure that the Western Empire was left in loyal hands while he focused on the Eastern Front. This division of the empire followed the previous division of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus a century before, though this time it was the senior Augusti who went east, with his junior partner remaining in Rome. One of the big problems we have in dealing with the crisis of the 3rd century is that establishing a definitive chronology through the chaos is almost impossible. What sources we have are contradictory and full of biases and outright fabrications. For example, even when we deal with a momentous event like Aurelian's evacuation of Dacia, all we can say is that it happened sometime between 271 and 274. Everything else is just guesswork. We can make good guesses, but they are nonetheless still guesses. Just how crossed up the history of the mid-3rd century can get begins to really become apparent during the joint reign of Valerian and Gallienus. For the next little while, dates are going to fall in ranges, and a lot of question marks are going to surround where people were and when they were there. We know basically what happened, and basically what order it happened in, but sometimes, well, we really don't. That all being said, Probably by early 254, Valerian was headed to Syria to survey the damage wrought by the recent Sassanid invasion. Gallienus, meanwhile, headed up north to the Rhine on a mission to repel Germanic incursions that had begun the minute Valerian picked up the legions guarding the border and marched them to Italy. The pattern of these northern invasions would become a familiar one over the next 20-odd years and highlight the cyclical nature of the 3rd century crisis. Anytime border troops were called elsewhere to deal with some emergency, barbarians beyond the frontier would invade the under-garrisoned territory left behind, forcing troops from elsewhere to be called in and plug the gap, leading to invasions in whatever territory those troops had just left behind, and so on and so on. Then, whatever territory was left holding the bag would have to look to their local commander to engineer a defense, and if he succeeded despite imperial aid, his troops would generally hail him as emperor, precipitating a civil war, forcing the existing emperor to come put down the uprising, and then the cycle would start all over again. Valerian's withdrawal of the Rhine legions to help him win power in Italy precipitated the beginning of one of these long cycles. Germanic tribes took the opportunity to pour across the border and raid the wealth of Gaul. The junior emperor's arrival in country seems to have brought an end to the pillaging, and between 253 and 255, Gallienus seems to have won a number of, if they can't quite be called battles, then at least significant skirmishes that forced the various tribes to withdraw back across the Rhine. Valerian, meanwhile, passed through the Balkans and marched across Asia Minor on his way to Syria. While he was on the move, the Goths and other associated tribes beyond the Danube appear to have prudently waited for the imperial army to pass before they renewed their forays into Roman territory. As soon as Valerian was gone, though, various independent Gothic groups once again began descending south in search of the great wealth of the Roman Empire. Valerian, though, had much bigger things on his plate than the Goths, who, though they had done damage to the empire's ego, were still small potatoes compared to the truly existential threat posed by the Sassanids. Where the Goths were dangerous rabble, the Sassanids were a well-organized rival civilization in the fullest sense of the word, and their attacks on the east threatened not just the rich provinces of Syria and Asia Minor, which accounted for a great deal of imperial tax revenue, but also the all-important province of Egypt and its critical grain supply. Valerian planted his court at Antioch, and for the next few years he rebuilt the Syrian capital and the infrastructure of the surrounding countryside. At some point, he retook the border city of Nispus, and by 257, things were mostly back to the way they had been before Shapur's great raid of 253. The Sassanid king could only sit back and watch the Romans regroup, as the presence of the emperor and his army were enough to make him think twice about simply repeating his invasion of a few years before. Of course, with Valerian in Syria and Gallienus in Gaul, the Danube frontier became the odd man out, and, as I just said, Gothic armies began to once again pour south across the river. Sometime around 255, this new invasion forced Gallienus to march in from the west and reinforce the Middle Empire. With the emperor on the scene, or should I say, with the resources the emperor brought with him on the scene, the Romans were able to once again plug the Northern League and push the Goths back across the river. But as Gallienus campaigned in the Middle Empire, the West inevitably slid back into chaos, forcing the junior emperor to head back to Gaul. Hoping to keep everyone in line after he was gone, Gallienus elevated his son, Valerian II, to the rank of Caesar and left the young man as the figurehead of record for all the Danube provinces. Actual administration of the provinces, though, was, critically, left in the hands of a general by the name of Ingenuus, who we will have cause to deal with in just a moment. The invasion Gallienus rushed back to deal with eventually became serious enough to draw all three members of the imperial tripartite to the lower Rhine. Valerian took a gamble that he would be able to leave the east in the hands of subordinates without triggering an invasion by Shapur, and, With Syria mostly rebuilt, he headed to Gaul in 257 to personally oversee the situation. That gamble would not pay off. As soon as Valerian left, the Sassanids were once again on the move. Obviously, this raises the question, what in the world could have been so serious that it brought Valerian all the way back from Syria to face? The answer lies in a superconfederation of Germanic tribes making their first, but certainly not last appearance in the history of Rome, the Franks. The Franks, who in time would become the reason why we call France, France, and not Gaul, were, as I just said, formed out of a collection of Germanic tribes who lived primarily along the lower Rhine. Likely included among their number were the Batavians, who, you'll recall, revolted against Roman rule while the empire was occupied with the Year of the Four Emperors, the Chatti, who Domitian so successfully propagandized victories over, and elements of the Cherusci, the tribe Arminius had led to victory in the Teutoburg Forest. This new confederation was formed gradually over the years, as the various Germanic leaders realized that they were getting nowhere fighting amongst themselves.
How about these?
The new Frankish supergroup was by no means a unified whole at this point, and the various barbarian kings still exercised a great deal of autonomy. But this new spirit of Germanic cooperation would in time become one of the answers to the question, why did the West fall when it did? As long as Rome was able to keep the tribes politically and militarily fractured, they had very little to fear. But once they joined forces, well, let's just say that there's a reason we call France France and not Gaul. In 257, Valerian Gallienus and Valerian II all appear to have been in the modern city of Cologne, along the lower Rhine, dealing with the sudden Frankish onslaught. Though the Franks were pushed back like all the other invaders of the mid-250s AD, at least one group kept moving forward, and eventually crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, sacking the undefended coast towns of the deep interior. But with all three emperors posted on the Rhine, the rest of the empire began to slip quickly back into what was becoming its natural state, chaos. In the north, a Gothic tribe hit upon a novel idea that their compatriots would use to great effect in the years to come, constructing a fleet to carry them down the Black Sea coast on a raid of Asia Minor. With the Franks mostly contained, Valerian left Gallienus in charge of Gaul, while he himself headed east. But the emperor wound up having no time to pause on this new Gothic invasion, and instead replanted Valerian II as imperial figurehead along the Danube, while he continued on to Syria. He was forced to keep moving because word had reached him that far from leaving well enough alone, Shapur was attacking Roman territory with renewed vigor.
At least you didn't pay much for it.
The next 2 years get really tricky for historians trying to cobble together a chronological narrative, as Valerian chose this moment to revive Roman persecutions of the Christians, leading eventually to the death of Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, in 258. Cyprian was a voluminous writer, and his collected correspondence has proved to be an invaluable resource to head to when we want to double-check when an event happened or whether it happened at all. Cyprian's writings act as a tiny little lighthouse in the distance, helping us navigate our way through the historical fog. But then the Romans went and killed him, leaving us with only random inscriptions, some coins, and gut instinct to lead us the rest of the way. So, thanks for that. There are three big things that happened during this 2-year period that we have trouble dating and putting in order. The Battle of Edessa and Valerian's subsequent capture by the Sassanids, the death of his grandson Valerian II, and the revolt of Ingenuus along the Danube. Some sources claim that Valerian II died of natural causes, and that when Ingenuus heard that Valerian had been captured, he decided that the imperial family was now weak enough to revolt against. Others claim that the ambitious Ingenuus decided to revolt simply because Gallienus and Valerian were both occupied elsewhere, that he killed Valerian II to kick off his campaign, and only later learned of Valerian's capture. Finally, we have the common version whereby it was the news of Valerian's capture that led Ingenuus to kill Valerian II and revolt against Gallienus. I don't have a good answer for which of these versions is actually correct, and I don't think anyone else does either. But a consensus seems to have grown up around the idea that Valerian II died under suspicious circumstances in 258, right around the time news reached the Danube that Valerian had joined the Sassanids in battle. In this telling, it is the news of war in the east that got Ingenuus' imagination running wild, rather than the news of the emperor's defeat. In this telling, there is a bit of a lag between the death of Valerian II and the official beginning of Ingenuus' revolt, but that when the commander on the Danube did have himself declared emperor, that Gallienus rushed over from the Rhine to put down the revolt before word of his father's capture reached the west. This all leaves 260 AD as the watershed year when the empire really melted down, with news reaching Gallienus almost simultaneously that the Sassanids had captured his father and that his own withdrawal from the Rhine had triggered a new invasion by the Germans. The defeat of Valerian at Edessa in the east and the Germanic invasions in the west were, of course, the two events that led directly to the empire breaking into thirds, a state of affairs that would persist for more than a decade until Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, the unconquered restorer of the world, put the pieces back together again in the early 270s. To deal with poor Valerian first, we must follow the emperor east in 258 after dropping Valerian II off in Pannonia. The emperor probably passed through Antioch on his way to the city of Edessa in northern Mesopotamia, where he planned to stage his coming counteroffensive. But this counteroffensive would never really get off the ground, as a nasty bout of the Cyprian plague broke out amongst the legions in 259, and Valerian's forces were left thin and weak as a result. Shapur decided to take advantage of the situation by marching on Edessa and challenging the emperor directly. Though we know very little about the details of the battle, it is reported that despite the toll taken on the legions, they still outnumbered the Sassanids by an almost 2-to-1 ratio, leaving Valerian confident that he would still be able to steamroll Shapur's forces. But, for whatever reason, in the battle that commenced on the plains outside Edessa, the Romans were utterly routed, and practically the entire army Valerian had brought with him were either killed or captured. We don't know how exactly Valerian fell into Shapur's custody, but the traditional Roman version has it that after the battle, Valerian arranged for a meeting with Shapur to hammer out the terms of a settlement, and after arriving at the Sassanid court, the emperor was seized by the treacherous Persian king and taken prisoner. The alternative is that Valerian was simply tracked down during the battle and seized, making it easy to see why the Romans would prefer a version of events that allows the humiliating capture of their emperor to be painted as a result of a double cross, rather than trying to explain how an honorable Roman could have allowed himself to be taken alive. As with just about everything to do with this period, there are two versions of what happened next. The boring version is that Valerian and his senior officers were treated well by Shapur, and lived out the rest of their days as comfortable, if involuntary, guests of the Sassanids until the emperor's death in 264. The more salacious version is that the no-good, wicked Persian king took every opportunity to humiliate the captured Valerian and used the Roman emperor daily as a stepping stool to get in and out of his royal litter. Then, when Valerian finally died, his body was flayed and stuffed and posted in the Persian court as a trophy for all of the East to mock and gloat over. Once again, it is easy to see why the Romans would prefer to paint the Sassanid king in the worst possible light. But barring a time machine, we'll never know the true fate of Valerian. We do know that he died in Persian custody, and that for a variety of reasons, no attempt was ever made to rescue him or pay a ransom for his return. He was in his mid-60s when he died, and had ruled the empire for 7 years. Those variety of reasons why nobody came looking for him had to do mostly with the fact that while the Eastern Empire was going to hell in a handbasket, The middle of the empire was going to hell in a handbasket, and the Western Empire was going to hell in a handbasket. In the final calculation, the life of one captured emperor was simply not worth the time and expense, not with so much hell being crammed into so many handbaskets.
Fair enough. Sure.
When news reached Gallienus that Ingenuus was in revolt,
Take it.
he was forced to immediately withdraw a significant portion of the Rhine troops from the border to help him put down the rebellion. As he had previously done with Valerian II, Gallienus left his second son Salonius in Cologne as imperial figurehead under the protection of the commander Marcus Cassianus Latinius Postumus, and sped off to the Danube. Leading the suppression effort was a man who, at this point, Gallienus had supreme confidence in, but whose own ambitions would in time lead to his master's death, the general Aureolus.
Fair enough.
As commander of the imperial cavalry, Aureolus led the charge into Pannonia, where the sudden appearance of Gallienus's army took the wind out of Ingenuus's sails, and the usurper either died in battle, was killed by his own troops, or committed suicide after realizing that his cause was hopeless. The upshot of all this, as I just mentioned, was that Gallienus's new position on the Danube led to a significant invasion of Germanic tribes along the Rhine.
Shiny coins.
Along the lower portion of the river, the Franks poured across the frontier as Postumus scrambled to hold them off with what forces he had been left with.
Seems reasonable.
Meanwhile, a huge group of Alemanni, a tribal super-confederation similar to the Franks operating along the Upper Rhine, poured through the under-garrisoned gap between the Danube and the Rhine, but rather than making for Gaul, as would have been expected, they instead decided to head directly into Italy. Obviously, this invasion of the home province was Gallienus's top priority. He ignored calls to go avenge his father in the east, who he just learned had been defeated and captured, reinforce Postumus in the west, or stay put on the Danube and hold off the Goths. He chose instead to make with all haste to Milan in northern Italy, a city that, with Gallienus's help, was about to become one of the most important cities in the empire. The Alemanni crossed the Alps into Italy before Gallienus could get in their way, and they apparently raided all the way down to Rome itself before being turned back by a hastily raised militia. Not necessarily needing to embroil themselves in a prolonged siege of the imperial capital after having grabbed so much of northern Italy's wealth, the Alemanni turned around, but on their way back north they were met by Gallienus, who beat them decisively outside of Milan. One independent faction of the Germanic invaders escaped back through the Alps with their captured treasure, but the rest were stopped short, and those who survived the battle headed back home empty-handed. Though in the end it turned out to have no long-term ill effects, the invasion of the Alemanni was nonetheless a significant psychic blow to a population of Romans already dealing with a lot of bad news. But I guess that to say that the invasion had no long-term effects is misstating the case a bit. Yes, the invaders were beaten and driven off, but the time, energy, and manpower required to do so left every other region of the empire feeling like they had been abandoned by the emperor.
Always love these exotic coins. Sure, why not?
In the east, the shattered legions were facing down a Sasanian army they could not hope to contain.
Yes, from me.
In the west, Postumus was being overwhelmed by the Franks, and in the middle, a Danube army just weakened by the battle between Ingenuus and Gallienus stared across the river at a host of tribes itching to take advantage of the emperor's recent withdrawal to Italy.
Take my first offer. Got some more?
With each of these regions left on their own,
Fair enough.
the various legionary commanders had to take it upon themselves to organize and direct local defenses, leading their troops naturally to give their commanders a rank befitting men who were now wielding supreme authority over their respective provinces. Imperator.
That's a yes from me.
Rather than receiving congratulations from his generals then for having driven the Alemanni out of Italy, Gallienus spent the weeks after his victory instead receiving notes that each of them had been proclaimed emperor by their troops. On the eve of his battle with the Germans, Gallienus had ruled an empire that stretched from Gibraltar to the Euphrates and from the Sahara to Scotland. The next morning, he found himself barely in control of Italy.
Got some more? Yeah.
Next week, we will watch the empire split into thirds. Though Gallienus was able to reassert his dominion over the Balkans, he had neither the money nor the manpower to do much about the East or the West, and they quickly devolved into autonomous political territories of their own.
Tiny coins, aren't they?
But this was not all bad news for Gallienus and Rome.
Fair enough.
Postumus's Gallic Empire and the about-to-be-established Palmyrene Empire were far more concerned with repelling foreign invasion than they were with domestic squabbles, and it turns out that they were both so successful at fighting off the Germans and Sassanids respectively
Always love these.
that it is hard to see how Gallienus himself could have ever done a better job. Ironically, the temporary breakup of the empire was perhaps one of the key reasons it was able to survive at all.
Sure. Why not? Shiny coins, aren't they? Don't give up.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 113, Three Empires. Though I haven't yet stated it explicitly, I think the nature of the military campaigns the Romans have lately been engaged in against the Goths and the Sassanids and the Franks and the Alemanni collectively speak for themselves. The Romans are now on the defensive. For its entire history, Rome had always projected outward. When battles were fought, they were fought in enemy territory. When battles were won, they enriched the empire with new wealth and new subjects. When battles were lost, it simply slowed the rate of Roman expansion. But now, the battles are being fought in Roman territory. When these battles are won, the reward is little more than a temporary peace, and far from enriching the empire, even victory was now a net loss on the balance sheet, in men, in money, in economic impact. And when those battles are lost, well, the very foundation of imperial legitimacy was the ability to provide physical